Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Ingrid Valladares. I am Office Coordinator at AIIA Victoria. Thank you for your interest and for joining us today. Just a few words on the running order. After this, the main presentation will go for around 30 minutes. We'll then do a Q&A session moderated by Alistair Robb, our Executive Director, for 20 minutes, and then we'll finish at 5:50 p.m. We will be using the Q&A tab in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions in there, or you can vote on questions that anyone else has asked. Today, to mark the 40th anniversary of Law Week and to recognize women's achievements in international law, we are very glad to be hosting the third event of our Women in International Affairs series. On this occasion, we have the great pleasure to be joined by Dr. Carrie McDougall, a remarkable lawyer with international experience in government, academia, and diplomacy. Carrie is a senior lecturer at Melbourne Law School. Before this, she worked at DFAD as Assistant Director at the International Law Section. She has also served as legal advisor at the Australian Mission of the United Nations in New York, where she led the Australian engagement on the responsibility to protect, also known as the R2P. Carrie joins us today to discuss her insights on international law and women's engagement. Carrie, thank you very much for your time and joining us today. I'll now hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Ingrid, and many thanks to the Victorian branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. It's an absolute honour to be partnering with you and to be part of the celebrations of the 40th anniversary of Law Week. When AIIA first approached me to speak on the subject of women in international law, I confess that my first reaction was that I'm not the right person to talk about this. I mean, yes, I'm a woman, I'm an international lawyer, but I don't, for example, consider myself to be a particular expert on something like women's human rights. But then I reflected on the conversations I've had over the years with people, further ahead of me in their careers when I was seeking advice, but also conversations I've had more recently with those trying to get a foot in the international law field. And I thought that, that is really what I would focus my remarks on. Now, I'm not entirely sure who makes up the audience of this evening's webinar. I'm assuming there's probably a mix of participants at different stages of their careers. So I'm going to make some observations that really, I hope will resonate with at least some members of the audience, starting with getting your foot in the door of international law. Moving on to sort of, highlight some of the hidden contributions of women in the international law field, and then ending on some reflections about the underrepresentation of women in top international law jobs. So, getting your foot in the door as an international lawyer. One of the really lovely things about being an international lawyer is that when you go to a meeting in the UN system, an academic conference, what have you, inevitably you'll know quite a few people in the room. And that's one of, my favourite parts of the job. I get to see friends and colleagues all around the world on a fairly regular basis, at least when we're not in lockdown as a result of COVID-19. But it's also a reflection of the fact that international law is actually a fairly small field, which means it's a highly competitive field and a field in which it can be hard to get started. So I thought I'd share one key piece of advice for those of you at the beginning of your career who want to work in international law. And that advice is, start your career today. If I think about my own career, I'd put, some of the amazing opportunities that I've been able to pursue down to hard work, down to luck of being at the right place at the right time, but also an ability to be able to leverage one experience to vault to another. And in that way, I think, some of my experiences as a 20-something, 20 odd years ago, were actually really pivotal to opening early doors for me, which allowed me to build up my CV and led to subsequent opportunities. So I thought I'd share with you the fact that, my work in international affairs really started off by my immersion for almost a decade in the work of the United Nations Youth Association. The leadership roles I held in AIIA led to me being selected as the female Australian representative at the World Youth Forum, which was held in Portugal in 1998, showing my age. While I was at the forum, I learnt about the existence of youth representatives that some countries had in their delegations to the UN General Assembly. I was elected to the forum's central drafting committee, and in that role was able to champion the inclusion of a call on states to establish youth rep positions. And that got into the World Youth Programme of Action, which we presented to then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan at the end of the forum. Now, not long after I returned to Australia, I was elected as National President of AIIA, and in that capacity was able to pursue the proposal with the Australian government. And happily, the then Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer, quite liked the idea and was prepared to override the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade's objections to it. And so I'm happy to say that since 1999, Australia has had a youth representative in our delegation to the UN, and the position's really gone from strength to strength. Because of my presidential duties in 1999, I wasn't able to apply for the inaugural youth rep position, but you can bet I was the very first person with my hand up the next year. Serving as youth rep in 2000 was absolutely, hands down, one of the best things to ever happen to me. Not only did I come back just completely inspired by experiences like sitting next to Jose Ramos Horta in the Security Council, being briefed by Nelson Mandela, chaired by Kofi Annan, I also got to work with our amazing ambassador to the UN at the time, Penny Wensley, who was very generous in sharing diplomatic pearls of wisdom with me. I also got to know a whole bunch of other DFAT colleagues and glimpsed into how both DFAT and the UN really worked. And that experience helped me immeasurably years down the track when I applied for a legal specialist position at DFAT. So I share that story in order to illustrate how one thing can lead to another. I also think it illustrates how important it is to start gathering relevant experience as soon as possible, and how important connections can be to opening up doors. Now, I absolutely understand that the current job market is incredibly tough, but if you are currently studying and are in a position or might be thinking about looking for work, I would think about, and you want a career in international law or international affairs, I would think about things like, being a research assistant for an international law academic, or working, at organisations like Amnesty International or Save the Children. If you're already working and are thinking about a future possible career change, maybe volunteering is a way to get some relevant experience. The Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, the Australian Red Cross are great places to start. I currently am the chair of the Red Cross Victorian AIIA Advisory Committee. And so from that vantage point can tell you that the organisation is always looking for more volunteers. And that can be, I think, these positions are really important because they give you relevant experience to draw on, and they help introduce you to people in the field already. And that can be critical because in such a small field, referee reports, personal recommendations are actually really highly valued in my experience. In that vein, I'd also recommend that you network. Unfortunately, with this particular event being online, it's difficult for us to make a meaningful connection tonight. But when we can all attend face-to-face meetings again, I really recommend go up to a speaker at the end of an event. Introduce yourself, ask a clever question if you can, and then ask the speaker if you can be in touch at some point by email to ask their advice about a career in their field. I actually think it's pretty rare for people to turn down a request like that. I'd also really urge you to remember that your peers are a really important part of your network. My former AIIA colleagues are still among my best friends today and a really important part of my own network. People from my era have ended up in amazing jobs all around the world, and we really do help each other out where we can in our professional lives. Obviously, this is about women in international affairs in particular, and I would say that I think peer networking is particularly important for women. We've spent so long trying to break through that glass ceiling that I think sometimes we forget or we run out of time and energy to turn around and help those coming up behind us. Sadly, I'd say that I've also known a number of senior women who seem to feel that they did it tough in getting to where they are, and seem to be of the opinion that if they could do it without any help, others should too. A sentiment that we might say was espoused by former Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, who famously declared she wasn't a feminist. Although I do acknowledge that since leaving politics, she seems to have become more of a women's champion, although arguably after she lost a great deal of her ability to effect change. For my part, over the years, I've become increasingly come to value the sisterhood, for want of a better word. And in preparing my remarks for tonight, I was actually really struck by the fact that I realised that without any planning on my part, I actually am part of a whole bunch of, different groups of friends and colleagues that are constituted primarily by women, who are incredibly generous in terms of, passing on articles of interest, reading drafts of applications or articles, sending emails around about different opportunities, nominating each other for awards. So make use of those networks because they do pay dividends. I actually probably have lots of other advice about starting out a career in international law. It's something I talk to my students at Melbourne Law School about quite a bit. So if this is a subject of interest when we get to the Q&A session of the webinar, do feel free to hit me up with questions that relate to that. Otherwise, before we turn to the subject of the underrepresentation of women in the top international law jobs, I wanted to make a few brief comments about the contribution that women are making to international law today, to make sure that we don't underestimate how significant that is. Now, some of those contributions are obvious. If I think of my own circle of connections, I think about women like, former International Criminal Court and ICTY judge Christine van den Winget and ICC prosecutor Fatou Bensouda. Closer to home, I point to examples like former president of the Australian Human Rights Commission and current UN Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, Professor Gillian Triggs, and Professor Hilary Charlesworth, a towering figure of international law in academia, who's currently undertaking her second stint as an ad hoc judge at the International Court of Justice. Perhaps less well known, but no less important, are the contributions of Australians like Helen Durham, the Director of International Law and Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross, Helen Brady, Head of the Appeals Section of the ICC Office of the Prosecutor, and Michelle Jarvis, former Deputy at the ICTY, currently Deputy at the Syria Accountability Mechanism. And of course, they're just a couple of select examples from my own circles. What I really wanted to focus my remarks on in this sort of section of the presentation was more about the hidden contributions of women international lawyers. In 2012, one of my former colleagues, the then Foreign and Commonwealth Legal Advisor in the UK, Daniel Bethlehem, published an article entitled "The Secret Life of an International Lawyer." And the thesis set out in Daniel's article is that much international law making is invisible to the general public because it happens internally within governments. So whether that's drafting treaties and Security Council resolutions and negotiating them behind closed doors, or contributions to the development of customary international law. Now, as a former government legal advisor, it won't surprise you to learn that I ascribe to Daniel's theory, but I would also add to his thesis. The UN, DFAT, international courts and tribunals, they're all very hierarchical institutions. And what that means is that while people sitting at the apex of those institutions can be very visible, a lot of the heavy lifting is actually done by the worker bees. And while I have no hard data on this, my anecdotal observations are that in many institutions, the majority of worker bees, and just quietly some of the strongest, are women. And those observations are consistent with the data that we do have about female law graduates outnumbering their male counterparts and females outnumbering males in the early stages of a legal career. Now, while I don't want to spend too much time tooting my own horn tonight, I do think I can illustrate that best by reflecting on my own experiences as an assistant director of the international law section at DFAT. Because I feel like there, even though it's not really visible to anyone outside of the organisation, I was able to make contributions to international law that I am proud of. So to give you an indication of the type of hidden contributions I'm talking about, let me give you a couple of concrete examples. So in the aftermath of the downing of flight MH17 over Ukraine, I wrote the UN Security Council resolution that was adopted. I did the majority of the drafting and the negotiating of the treaties Australia entered into with the Ukraine and the Netherlands. And in partnership with a Dutch colleague, drafted the lion's share of the statutes for the tribunal that Australia, the Netherlands, Ukraine, Belgium and Malaysia proposed be established by the Security Council. Similarly, the advice prepared for the Australian government on Australia's exercise of collective self-defence on behalf of Iraq, in Syria against ISIS, bears the signatures of the head of Office of International Law at the Attorney General's Department and the senior legal advisor of DFAT. But just quietly, it reflects a position that I alone at the outset was advocating for, and much of the content was my drafting. And I don't want to suggest by any stretch of the imagination that I'm unique. The UN General Assembly's Sixth Committee is somewhat special compared to the other committees of UNGA because its interactions are really characterised by a respect for fellow legal advisors' technical expertise. So in other words, rather than being blinded by the polemical policy positions of states, legal advisors have a real appreciation for subject matter expertise. And so the most influential delegates in the Sixth Committee are often masters of their subjects. And if I think of the movers and the shakers of the Sixth Committee during my time in New York, the powerhouses, it did include some men, but the powerhouses were overwhelmingly women. Delegates from the UK, Switzerland, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Austria all come to mind. And that's not because of the countries that they represented, but rather because they were really great international lawyers. myself, having been elected to the Bureau of the Sixth Committee and serving as Vice President after being in New York for less than a year, and as someone who was frequently approached for technical advice by the delegates of other countries, I'd like to think that in New York too, I was able to make a contribution to international law. And I really wanted to highlight that because I think, it's not publicly visible, it's not recorded, but we should remember that behind the scenes, women are making really valuable contributions. Of course, despite all of these really remarkable contributions, there really is no getting around the fact that women are underrepresented in the top international law jobs, whether that's as judges, members of the International Law Commission, or as the senior legal advisors in foreign ministries. And of course, that's a problem. It means that women aren't getting the acknowledgement for the heavy lifting that I've just been talking about. It means that the institutions of international law are sending poor messages about equality and the value of the skills and experience of female international lawyers. And it means that when those at the apex of international institutions are responsible for making decisions about international law or that shape international law, the voice of women isn't heard or isn't heard as loudly as it should be. And that's particularly important because the law is, beyond doubt shaped by those who make it. So why is this the case and what can we do about it? There's no doubt that overt discrimination does exist in some quarters. Like many women, I have at least some personal experience of this. When I was a research fellow, a big project I worked on was drafting protection of civilians guidelines for the African Union's standby force on behalf of the Australian government and the African Union in consultation with the UN and the ICRC. And the final stage of the drafting was done in Addis Ababa. And I very vividly recall in our first meeting on the ground being asked by a certain African general to make him some tea because he presumed that that's what I was in the room to do as a young female. The idea that I would be responsible for capturing discussions and reflecting them in the next iteration of the revised guidelines simply didn't cross his mind. And I have had my share of being inappropriately touched or being propositioned out of the blue by senior male international lawyers. I think a linked problem is that in the context of international law, all too often women are thought of as being part of that women and children composite that we see reflected in older treaty texts. In other words, as objects that need protection or as victims. Now, this, of course, was all meant to change with the introduction of the Women, Peace and Security agenda at the UN, which underlines the very important role that women can play as agents of change. And in fact, the fact that that role is critical to an inclusive and lasting peace. But there is still a very big gap there between words and action. And so I think it's fairly obvious, for my money at least, that we need to continue to champion women's rights and to fight for equality. If I think of my time at the UN and some of the debates, I saw in the third committee that were really toxic concerning anything to do with gender, sexuality, reproductive rights. I think it's fairly obvious that we still have a long way to go for women's rights to be realised and discrimination ended. And I think that is an important part of levelling the playing field for women who aspire to the top jobs in international law, particularly those positions that require a vote of UN member states. So you're taking into account the views of lots of different countries in relation to women's rights. That's probably a pretty long-term game. So I wanted to make some comments about what I thought we might be able to do more immediately. I think it's fair to say that affirmative action has been used effectively in some circumstances. As you may be aware, the current UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, has appointed an extraordinary number of women to senior positions. And while it's too early to say what impact that has had, if any, on the UN's operations, it certainly has sent a very powerful message. This said, I think it's important to acknowledge that I've also seen some examples of affirmative action not working well at all. So the requirements for the election of judges to the International Criminal Court are incredibly complex, but in short, the Rome Statute requires particular expertise, equal regional representation, and a fair distribution of male and female judges. And that, in broad terms, translates to a requirement that there be at least 6 judges of each gender on the court. Now, not least because of the way the cumulative regional and gender requirements operate, we've seen in multiple electoral cycles that we've had to go hunting for female candidates. And the ones that have eventually been nominated and sometimes, frankly, elected by default are not always the best candidates, which has, I think, had some pretty serious flow-on effects for the quality of the ICC bench. Closer to home, I was at DFAT when the department introduced its Women in Leadership initiative, aimed at addressing the underrepresentation of women ambassadors and women in other departmental leadership positions. Understandably, I think, male colleagues were fairly concerned about the idea of promotion on the grounds other than merit. Even more nuanced ideas like taking action not to penalise women for time taken out of the workforce in relation to childbirth and childcare proved very difficult to implement. I remember sitting in a DFAT focus group, hearing about the Women in Leadership initiative, hearing one female colleague after another telling their stories of having taken a year or two off work to have one or multiple children, and coming back only to see their male counterparts, well ahead of them on the career ladder, and feeling like they had no chance of catching up because of their ongoing commitment to childcare. And I was pretty nervous by the end of the focus group seminar when I finally got enough guts to make an intervention. And what I said was that, as a single woman at the time, I sympathised with the position of these women, but at the same time, in the year or two that my female colleagues were on leave looking after their children, I put in some pretty hard yards and it gained some pretty valuable experience. And I didn't think that should be altogether discounted or ignored. I was also pretty upset when I was repeatedly asked to take over a female colleague's work at 6 p.m. at night to ensure that it was completed while she went off to collect her children. How was I ever going to meet anyone and have children of my own if, as the single woman, I was always the one being asked to work back late to help out the section? Now, what isn't obvious, because you can only see my head and shoulders, is that I'm currently 33 weeks pregnant. So maybe I'll feel very differently about these things in the very near future. But I think what these experiences have taught me is that we need some more nuanced approaches than the blunt tools of affirmative action. In relation to time out of the workforce, in relation to childbirth and childcare, for example, I think the solution has to focus much more squarely on, institutional or cultural change, creating incentives for men to take parental leave, and creating ways for opportunities for women who want to keep in touch with their workplace and to continue to build their skills while on parental leave without losing their leave entitlements. Or otherwise, supplementing the workforce to allow more flexibility for those with childcare obligations without just passing their work on to other members of a team. I myself had never really thought of myself as a feminist until about 10 years ago, when I had what I can only describe as an awakening, as naff as that might sound. I joined a book club in Canberra, and members of this group that I was part of took turns to nominate a book. And we were about 2 books into my tenure as a member when the nominated book was the Chief Operating Officer of Facebook, Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In. I inwardly rolled my eyes and groaned. I was working around the clock at DFAT. I strongly believed that life's too short to read bad books. I had 0 interest in reading some women's self-help book. But I was new to the group. I didn't want to come across as a book snob, so I dutifully went and got my copy and started reading. And soon after, I have to tell you that I was reduced to tears, because on every other stage was a story that could have been lifted from my own professional life. Sandberg, for example, writes at length about the fact that she and other women she knew had faced endless criticism throughout their careers for being too assertive, too forceful, too sure of themselves, characteristics for which men are rarely criticised. And I was like, oh my God, that's me. That's every performance review I've ever had. And I suddenly realised that, some of the things that I'd come to think of as my greatest flaws were in many ways a reflection of unconscious bias on the part of others. And I've absolutely seen the same thing happen at the UN. So in the last election for the UN Secretary General, we held town hall meetings between member states and the candidates. And for my money, and the money of many others I've spoken to, the top performers hands down were former New Zealand PM and head of UNDP, Helen Clark, and the architect of the Paris Climate Accord, Christina Figueres. And yet neither woman was ever in the running seriously for the top job at the UN. Now, there are a lot of complex geopolitical reasons for that, but at least part of it, I think, was the fact that both women were seen as too assertive and too forthright, despite their record of success. I can't tell you how many male ambassadors I heard comment on these types of personality traits, with no mention of the fact that some of the male candidates for the SG position could barely get out a coherent sentence in response to some of the trickier questions they were asked in the town hall meetings. And so I think we need to put more effort into addressing this unconscious bias, and at the same time to actively champion and to value we demonstrate some of the softer, more nurturing leadership skills that are, generally speaking, of course, more frequently exhibited by women. I've absolutely no doubt that if we do this, international law will be all the better for it. So I'm conscious of the time. I have a stop clock next to me. So I'll leave my remarks there and hand it over to Alastair to help me with the Q&A portion.
Absolutely. Carrie, thank you so much. Just to introduce myself for anyone who wasn't on right at the beginning, I'm Alastair Roth. I'm Executive Director of AIIA Victoria and working closely with my colleague Ingrid. Carrie, thank you so much for taking part, and you've covered lots of the general topics. I have to say we've got about at least 200 people logged on watching us, so thank you everyone who's online and for your support and interest. And the questions are sort of falling into, I guess, a couple of camps of career related and also some geopolitical. So I'll get through as many as I can. But really, really interesting, some of what you've been saying. It's certainly striking a chord here. You made a comment, I think, that females are outnumbering males now in the law. Would you say, I mean, there's a question about the glass ceiling. Would you say that the glass ceiling is broken now to an extent in the law? Apart from the fact your own career seems to demonstrate that. But.
Look, I think it's hard because I think, yes, I mean, you know, as a teacher at Melbourne Law School, I certainly see, you know, amazingly strong female law students. We know that in our cohort, women sort of have the edge over male graduates in landing their jobs, well, their first jobs, which, you know, from Melbourne Law School is predominantly in corporate law rather than international law. You know, my observations are that there are more women in international law jobs as well at that entry and mid-tier level, but they don't seem to be, you know, there's not an equality at the top, which I think, you know, does speak to a glass ceiling or career interruptions as a result of children. You know, I think, you know, one of my good friends who happens to be a doctor and a mum of 4 boys said to me not long ago that, you know, women these days can do anything, but you can't do everything. And that's something that resonates with me, who has had to make, you know, some difficult career choices for personal reasons. You know, I left a great, wonderful job that I loved in New York because my, you know, then fiance, now husband, hated it. I was absolutely miserable. And, you know, I wanted to be a wife and a mother. And so, you know, I made the choice to prioritise that for a little while over my career in international law. So I think, you know, yes, there's a hole in that glass ceiling, but whether it's as easy for women to get to the top of the field as men, I think is something we're still working on.
Just staying on New York, I suppose, and UN, question, when do you think there may be a female Secretary General? And I suppose, just as an aside to that, I'm conscious that I think at the end of this month, it's the UN Day of International Peacekeepers. Separately, there's a body of opinion that suggests that women are far better at negotiating peace or preventing conflict. And so is there a role there, if not at Secretary General level, one of the Assistant Secretary Generals?
Yeah, so the Secretary General one is a really interesting one. You know, I think if we'd been freely able to vote on merit, I mean, Antonio Guterres, I think, has done a remarkable job, but I think Helen Clark and Cristina Figueres, as I said in the last election, you know, really were quite remarkable in presenting a coherent, logical, inspiring vision for what they wanted the UN to do. I mean, it's difficult because it's not just about the gender question, it is about geopolitics and, you know, for better or worse, because of the influence of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, often the successful candidate is not the strongest, but the least offensive. And particularly someone who is able to simultaneously not offend, you know, the P3 and the P2, so to speak. So I think, on the other hand, you know, as I mentioned, Antonio Guterres has appointed, you know, really impressive number of wonderful women to senior posts. And he has a vision for integrating the 3 pillars of the UN's work, so peace and security, development, and human rights. And in speaking about the importance of integrating the UN's work, he has in particular made the point that you made, Alastair, about the important contribution that women make as leaders, in particular in peace processes. So, like, I have no doubt that, you know, over time we'll see more and more women taking on more and more important roles. We just need to get everyone behind that idea.
So you excuse me, you've mentioned some strong and impressive women there. Have any of them played a particular role in mentoring your own career, or have there been any influential mentors who've helped you along the way?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the reasons I was slow to realise I was a feminist or needed to be a feminist was because I had some really amazing female leadership role models early on in my career. I briefly mentioned Ambassador Penny Wensley, who of course went on to become the Governor of Queensland.
In fact, I might just, having mentioned her in such glowing terms, I believe she actually is in the audience. So.
Oh, hello, Penny, then. Well, that's very humbling. So, you know, I really did feel that my brief time at the UN as the youth representative was so valuable because she was so generous in explaining, you know, what she was doing and why she was doing it, which was, you know, such a huge learning experience for me. I also worked with Robin Moody, who now holds, she was at the time the representative of the Australian mission to the Third Committee, but she went on to hold very senior positions at the UN. At DFAT. So you know, she too taught me a great deal about foreign affairs. So yes, I've been very lucky in my career to work with very fantastic women.
I'm just going to flick to the most popular question, which many are asking is, I mean, you talked about how you start to break into a career in a very competitive environment, but do you have any advice how to get a foot in the door if you're doing a more general degree in international relations as opposed to more specific vocational law related degree? Because I think there are many people probably dialed in here who are students of international relations looking for a career with an international component of some sort.
Sure. I mean, I think one thing to be aware of as an Australian, if that's assuming that's the majority of our audience, is to think about, you know, what area of international affairs you want to be in. And by that, I don't so much mean subject matter like international trade law or international trade or human rights, although that can be important. You know, I think you really need to think about whether you are the sort of person who wants to be an advocate fighting against the status quo and therefore perhaps working for a think tank or an NGO, whether you want to work for the UN or one of the related institutions like the ICC, or whether you're someone who I guess wants to perhaps have a more obvious influence on the content of international law by working for government. Because I think in some ways it does require different skills and different people are attracted to those different career paths. You know, I started off my career as something of a youth activist, I guess, working with AIIA, and so I fell more in that NGO bracket. You know, at the time I was youth representative, you know, DFAT colleagues were saying to me, oh, come and work at DFAT. But at the time, Conservative government, around the time of the 2003 Iraq War, it wasn't going to work for government, wasn't something that I felt comfortable with at the time. You know, many years later, I had the opportunity when I was doing my PhD, which was on the crime of aggression, to join the Australian delegation to those negotiations, which gave me a second opportunity to work with colleagues at DFAT. And I realised that actually for me, what was, I guess, most attractive about a career in international law was really shaping it. And that is most effectively done, I think, by working for a government. And by then, you know, some 10 years later, I'd changed my thinking a little bit, I think, to think more about the fact that, you know, as a lawyer, at least, you are providing advice to a client, and that client just happens to be a government. So, I mean, I think you need to, it helps to make some strategic choices to build up your CV and to direct your studies, I guess, depending on which of those career paths you want to head towards. The other thing I think it's, you know, perhaps useful to bear in mind is that people in international affairs tend to be overqualified for their jobs. You know, it's a really competitive field, and particularly if you want to work in the UN system, the idea of equitable geographic representation is very dominant. And it just so happens that the Western Europe and other group of which we're a member tend to put forward some of the strongest candidates on merit, which of course is a reflection of the fact that we have great education systems, easy access to the internet, so making an application is easier, etc. And my own theory is that Australians are overrepresented within WEOG because there are so few opportunities to pursue a career in international affairs here. Many people take the leap at an early stage of their career and move overseas. So to get a position, especially your first position in international affairs in the UN system, you kind of have to be the best of the best. And so I think, thinking about things like further study, whether that's masters or a PhD, or, doing things like I spoke about, volunteering and thinking about how to build up your CV, is quite important because people do tend to be, overqualified.
That ties right into another of the popular questions, but a lot of the volunteer positions you talked about are themselves very competitive.
Yeah.
How do you stand out even to get picked as a volunteer, let alone to be paid for a role?
Yeah.
Opposed to CV and networking and experience, as you said. But
yeah. Look, I think the best advice I could give is, during my time at the Australian mission to the UN, I sat on our internship committee. And, of course, we were looking for someone with a strong academic record, but let's face it, we got lots of applications from smart cookies. So we were also looking for someone who was a team player and who understood that as an intern, they wouldn't actually be developing Australian foreign policy. But a lot of people also fit that bill. So I think what really made the successful candidates stand out was, some demonstration of a long-term passion for international affairs. Whether it was, the selection of their optional subjects at university, some of their extracurricular writing or some personal story that was included in their cover letter. Because at least during my time, we felt that doing an internship at the UN mission was a really incredible opportunity and potentially a life-changing experience. And we wanted to reward someone that wasn't just looking to CV build or for another feather in their cap, but who was, really excited about a job in this field.
For those internships, I guess you have to go through the application process from Australia, but I've heard that sometimes internships are posted purely locally on the local website of the mission, that you have to be hunting around to look for them. There's not necessarily a central pool. Is that right, that you can go and look at specific missions where you might want to work and just stumble across an internship?
So in my experience, certainly the positions at the Australian mission in New York are advertised and can absolutely be applied for. In fact, they have to be applied for from people within Australia and Australian citizens, in fact. I think we have a handful of other posts in Australia's diplomatic network, including our post in Geneva, who offer internships. I'm not as familiar with their advertising process, but I believe that it is all done online. I think for some of those internships, particularly at maybe NGOs or international governmental organisations that are based in New York, they might not be advertised quite so widely. And I certainly, some of my contemporaries decided on a wing and they were, I guess, much more open to taking risks than I were. And they sort of moved to New York with nothing lined up and just sort of knocked on doors and found opportunities. And, happily, all of them have gone on to very successful careers after a couple of early years of doing the hard yards.
Yeah. If we just move slightly to geopolitical, because there's some interest there too, what role do you think international law may play in the next 1 to 2 years after COVID? Do you think is it going to have a big impact on multilateral organizations in the UN? You see the role of an international lawyer changing?
Awesome question. Really hard to answer in a soundbite. I don't know. I think we're at this, in many ways it feels to me like we're at this crossroads or this tension point. because we've had so much in the last few years about, threats to the international rules-based order. We see the election of popularist governments and this retreat to nationalism, as well as the fact that, countries that we perhaps wouldn't describe as being like-minded, starting to suggest that their views are not adequately reflected in the existing rules of international law, and starting to offer new interpretations of core rules of international humanitarian law or the jus ad bellum. So that, I think was worrying a lot of international lawyers, that the existing system, which has been a core part of, peace and security in the Charter era, was being challenged. In terms of the impact of COVID, it's early, so it's difficult to speculate. In some ways, maybe this demonstrates that actually we need international cooperation and collaboration in order to face global challenges like COVID-19, but also climate change or terrorism or things that countries, or challenges that countries can't adequately address by going it alone, or just acting in concert with their closest allies. So I have to say I'm an optimist rather than a pessimist. So I like to think that maybe some reminders like this will remind us that international law is really valuable. And in that context, I think it's perhaps worth just finally mentioning that, international law tends to be a crisis discipline. A lot of the big advances in the law have been made on the back of international crises. So maybe COVID will be the latest example of that.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. I'm conscious we're sort of up against our time. Are you okay for another few minutes if we keep going? Because there's still some questions. If people are happy to still dial in, we're happy to keep going for a little bit. But one of the how important are your own beliefs and values to your work? Are there times that, for the diplomacy's sake, for example, you find you're having to compromise? How do you deal with that?
I guess people will have different personal reflections on this. I mentioned earlier that I didn't feel, I could work for the Australian government, around 2003, because I felt like my own views were sharply at odds with the government of the day. When I applied to work for DFAT, in fact, it was that year that we had that hung election and Julia Gillard had to form a minority government. And so my first few days in the office were a little nervous because I was not sure what government I would be working under. But of course, as my career at DFAT progressed, I worked for many, many years under conservative governments. And I'm happy to say that, in my time as a lawyer at government, I didn't ever feel any pressure to provide anything other than what I thought was the best legal advice. Now, that doesn't mean a minister or cabinet always agreed with that advice, but I think you reach a point in your career where you realise that is the prerogative of a minister, that your job as a lawyer is to give advice. I guess I was quite lucky in that, in working on the jus ad bellum, international humanitarian law, international criminal law, that I was really able to pursue policies that I personally, believed very strongly in. It's probably fair to mention that when I started at the department, I was asked if there was anything that I would have felt really uncomfortable working on. And I did say I really didn't want to work in the refugee and asylum seeker space. And happily only ever had to when I was in an acting capacity. So, I think at least in my experience, workplaces are sensitive if you've got strong personal views on things. And in my experience, I didn't ever feel like I had to compromise any of my own values to do my job well.
That's good. There's interesting. How do you, when you're confronted with unacceptable conduct, not just an African general asking you to make tea, but worse, as you described, how do you manage your outrage when that's happening in a supposedly professional sector?
So in terms of conduct directed to me or me witnessing,
when you said you've been inappropriately touched or whatever, how do you deal with that when it's happening in a sector that's supposed to be professional?
Yeah, look, what I did and what I'd advise someone to do are probably different things. I think at the time I was just so shocked that I just tried to move away as quickly as possible and pretend it hadn't happened. But with the benefit of hindsight and I guess the wisdom of more years, I think actually we need to call that conduct out. And, the wake of the Me Too movement, maybe that's become a little bit easier. Which is not to say it's easy, but I think, it is, if we're going to stop this conduct, really important that it's labelled as wrong. And so I would definitely, encourage women to support each other, men and women, but particularly women to support each other, where people do make the choice to make a public complaint. And to make sure that the right sort of psychosocial support is provided, because it's not easy.
Well, we're getting close. We'll possibly do another couple of questions if you're happy, and then we probably should wrap up by 6 o'clock, was what we said. Sure. Just that there are, I think we've got a range of students. We've got a couple of year 12 people, I think. Just question: what did you do year 12? What's your career progression look like from tertiary until that? And how much studying have you done? People
for me?
Yes.
So in a nutshell, finished uni, was a commercial litigator at one of Melbourne's leading law firms for, I think, about 3 years. Went back to uni to do my PhD. Hasten to add, I thought I'd quit the day I got admitted. I went to a commercial law firm to be fully qualified as a lawyer. Always intended to go into international law, but got caught up in the world of running to court, and litigating was lots of fun. So I did a PhD in international law, as I said, on the crime of aggression. Was really lucky in that context to work with the Australian delegation to the aggression negotiations. Very lucky again at the end of my PhD. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. I had some opportunities to take up academic positions, but I sort of decided it wasn't really for me, and ended up applying for DFAT. The DFAT career job application process is a very long one. So I was lucky enough to be offered this research fellowship at Melbourne Law School, working with the Australian government on the protection of civilians guidelines I mentioned. Got the job at DFAT as a legal specialist, assistant director. Was in Canberra for, I think, 5 or 6 years, and then posted to New York as legal advisor at our mission to the UN. And then from there, just happened to be looking around for a job at the time when Melbourne Law School advertised for an international law academic. So in many ways was able to come home, and am now happily teaching and researching in international law at MLS.
Sorry, I was muted. Maybe the final question before you hit 6 o'clock, but I suppose as it's Law Week here, someone's asking, as a young lawyer in corporate law, do you have any advice how to move then into international law?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I speak to a lot of students about potential careers in international law, and I always say, if you think you can do it, go and do commercial law for a year or 2 or 3 or 4. Because I think law school teaches you, how to work out what the law is, but actually practicing for a few years teaches you how to be a lawyer. And, I worked across passionate, smart, wonderful colleagues at DFAT, but I worked alongside a number of colleagues who went straight from an undergraduate degree to the department and never worked in practice as a lawyer. And I think, they were missing some really important skills that you gain in commercial law, or any sort of practice of law. So I think, you are gathering skills that are going to be hugely valued by a future employer in international law. As I said, I think it's about, starting to, dip your toes in the water, whether that's with some, part-time master's study on the side or some volunteering, attending webinars like this, getting to know people, in the field who can give you some advice. They're all, you know, the first steps that I would recommend someone take.
We could, sorry, I was on mute again. We could keep going. There's a range of questions, but I think you've covered many of them. I think you've inspired a lot of the people watching. From our side, thank you, Carrie, very much for taking part. We wish you all the best in the future with your work and whatever else is coming with your family. But really great to have you. And I wish we could sort of, yeah, as you said, do some networking face-to-face after this, I think would be great. But maybe one day we'll be able to get you back actually here and do it, and you can inspire people again. But really appreciate having you on. Thank you everyone else who's been watching for your interest and taking part, and we wish you all well, and we'll see you next time at the next webinar. Thanks again, Carrie, very much.
Thanks, Alistair.
Again,